Hi, everyone. I hope that you had a great weekend. And I wanted to say, if you're watching this early in the day, I'm probably at the hospital. If you're watching this sort of in the middle of the day, my wife is probably having a baby right now. And if you're watching this near the end of the school day, the baby's already probably here. And I will certainly keep all of you posted and give details and pictures. I do appreciate all the good thoughts that you guys have given me over the last week or so. Today, I'm going to talk about the Treaty of Versailles and a little bit about totalitarianism. I won't talk all that long, and I want to point out, first of all, that there's going to be a lot of information. I'm not going to pause as long during this as I would in class, largely because these slides are posted, and I don't need to just sit here on Zoom, watching, while you guys are writing. You have access to the notes, to the slides. Please go back and take notes. There's a lot of information. So if you give me a second to share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk first about the Treaty of Versailles. This is Versailles. It is a palace. It was built by King Louis XIV. Versailles itself is a suburb of Paris, just outside the city of Paris, about a 20-minute train ride. And it's a beautiful, beautiful palace. It's a lot all the time. It's huge. It is incredibly gaudy, ornate, lots and lots of gold and mirrors. It's shiny. You see why politicians and other diplomats who tend to want to think of themselves as incredibly important or some sort of remnant of a previous time in life, in history, would like to meet here. First of all, it's a palace, so there's lots and lots of rooms for them and their staff, but also it's, it reminds them of sort of a grander time when, leaders can meet in big places like this. I actually have been to Versailles a few times. It's certainly worth doing if you're ever in Paris. This is me and my wife on our honeymoon about 9 years ago. This is a picture I took. It's the outside of Versailles, sort of as you've gotten your tickets and you're waiting in line to go in. It's like a lot of things. You have timed access to it because there's so many people. It's a major tourist site. So let's talk about this. World War I ended in November of 1918. We're talking about November 11th, 1918, what we consider today to be Veterans Day. In the summer of 1919, this is roughly 6 months later, so 5-6 months after the war ends, US, UK, France, and Italy. I'm calling them the four great powers, and I'm not sure to the extent to which we would really consider Italy to be a great power. They had fought on both sides in the war. They certainly were less powerful than any of the other three, but they were the other country that had been invited and whose leader had been invited to participate as a full and equal member at the conference. So I'm going to include them in this. So keep that in mind. And their goal was really what comes next. All right, with the old order of Europe, we're talking about all these empires, these countries had sort of been ripped apart and needed to be remade. The continent itself needed to be rebuilt, especially France and Belgium and Netherlands. There's so much destruction from the trenches and the fighting and the bombing and chemical gas and all of these different things that they needed to figure out what comes next. I do want to point out a few things. First of all, representatives of Germany, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire were not invited as members that could really negotiate. Russia, kind of understandable. They had first been an ally, first of all. And second of all, they were actively involved in their own civil war at the time. They were transforming from the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. And so they were quite focused internally. I get that. The Ottoman Empire was dissolving. It was in the process, actually it had been in the process for a while, of becoming Turkey, and then sort of the rest of the Middle East, which would be then divided by Britain and France in ways that were perhaps not entirely smart. But the big ones that had been omitted from this conference were Germany and Austria. And you might think, well, Dr. Levin, I mean, they lost the war. They were sort of responsible for at least escalating it. Maybe not. They maybe don't think they were responsible for everything, but they were responsible for escalating it. So why should they get to negotiate? And that makes sense. I understand that, and it's sort of the opinion certainly of France. But the problem they're going to run into is when all of these conditions and terms of the treaty are imposed upon Germany and Austria, the people in these countries are going to be very resentful. They're going to have extremely negative feelings about it. They're going to feel like, well, hey, everyone participated in this. Why are we being punished? Why are we being punished so harshly? And they are, going to feel like they need to do something to regain their sense of national power. And we'll talk about that over the next couple of weeks, but that's going to have negative consequences. So here are the big four. We'll put them all up here. Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States. David Lloyd George was the prime minister of Great Britain. Georges Clemenceau was the premier of France. And Vittorio Orlando was the president of Italy. You see them all here. They are, some great mustaches in this picture and one very tall top hat. Another picture of them. This is sort of them outside the conference. I think congratulating themselves and each other for a treaty that had been signed. You just see President Wilson there on the right. So let's talk a little bit about what each of these countries wanted. And I know, guys, that there is a lot of material here. Like I said in sort of my introduction, if you need to go back and do this again and see it and look at the slides are posted. I'm not going to give you as much time as I normally would to write things down because you guys can do that on your own. What did France want from this treaty? Well, I mean, they, as the country who neighbored Germany and had taken on the brunt of the fighting and whose country was the most destroyed, they wanted security. They want Germany not to be able to do this again. And they want Germany to pay for the damage. I get it. If we were attacked by Canada, which seems quite far-fetched, but just stay with me for this thought experiment, I suspect that many Americans would want Canada to pay for the damage they caused to us as well, no matter what the consequences were to Canada and how that might sort of tip the balance of power one way or the other. Clemenceau was determined that Germany should be made to pay for the damage, and that had been the damage that had been caused to northern France by the invading German armies. This was his main goal. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to be sort of a middle path here. The British had fought valiantly. They had lost millions of men. Their fighting had sort of devastated this entire generation of men, and it shaped the consciousness of the British public. But, and this is important, Britain itself was not harmed really. The island of Great Britain was left untouched, unlike in World War II. And so David Lloyd George did not have the same need to punish Germany. They recognized that Germany, did not need to, they did not need to exact their kind of revenge the same way France did. Lloyd George in public said, yeah, we're going to punish Germany and Germany should be made to pay. But in private, he realized, and this is what they'll realize after World War II as well, that destroying a country, and a huge, powerful country like Germany, punishing it in such a way that they could not stand on their own feet again, only destabilizes the rest of Europe. It destabilizes the rest of Europe, meaning the country needs to be able to rebuild. Now, that could take a little bit, and it's okay to have some reparations, but the idea of destroying them economically would be bad. And the other thing is that David Lloyd George was quite concerned, as were many leaders in Europe, about communism. They saw that communists had been able to overthrow the Russian Tsar, the emperor of Russia, and they thought, oh my gosh, could this happen here? Could communism come to Great Britain? And communists then execute the King of England, the King of Great Britain? Is that possible? And so this was the start of sort of the British version of the Red Scare that we talked about in the last unit. And David Lloyd George did want a strong Germany, so a not destroyed Germany, to be kind of a barrier against communist aggression. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, he wanted the treaty to be based on what he called his 14 points. We're not going to get into them, but the big one is the League of Nations, which we'll talk about in a second. He believed Germany should be punished, but sort of in line with the end of normal wars. Yes, Germany lost. They should have to pay for that. But Germany should be able to then stand back up on their own feet relatively quickly. And that Germany should not be left feeling like the Allies just destroyed them. He wanted to establish the League of Nations, which does in fact come into existence without the United States. And it is the forerunner of today's United Nations. The goal of the League was going to be to settle all these disputes that might arise between different countries so that another world war would not happen. Woodrow Wilson looked at how devastating this had been for Europe, for his allies, for his enemies, and thought, let's try to avoid this going forward. He's going to have some issues with this. First is really two main problems that Wilson has. The first is that the American public, as we talked about in a previous unit, was incredibly isolationist. The only reason we ever really got involved in World War I in the first place was because the British had discovered the Zimmermann telegram, and Germany announced openly that they were resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. Other than that, we probably would have stayed out. And so Wilson wanted to have the American public agree to join the League of Nations, so maintain a role in the world where the American public wanted to become more isolationist again. And the second problem is that shortly after returning from Europe in July of 1919, Wilson has a massive stroke. And this leaves him largely incapacitated, unable really to do his job, for one thing, but second, to go around the country and try to convince Americans of what he wanted to do and what the goals of the treaty were. He wasn't able to do that. And so American public was never really convinced. And America actually never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles, never joins the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, not just because of that, but for other reasons as well, but the League of Nations fails. I mean, there's another World War 20 years later. That's not a successful institution. What specifically did the treaty say? Well, there's a few things. Germany had to give up land to France as well as other countries like Poland. That's a fairly normal sort of consequence of war. All right, Germany had taken two provinces from France. They're called Alsace and Lorraine. They're sort of right on France's eastern border and Germany's western border, and they went back to France after World War I. Number two is a big one. It said, and we'll come back to this in a second, that Germany must accept guilt for starting the war. This is Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germans are not going to like this. They're going to feel like that's unfair to blame Germany and Austria-Hungary for the war entirely, which I kind of agree with. We talked about the conditions for the war. There's all sorts of countries involved in setting up what happened. Number three, Germany had to give up colonies. Number four, all countries agreed to reduce the size of the military, but Germany's was reduced to 100,000 men at the most. And they were forbidden from having tanks. Now, this actually does not last all that long because at some point, Hitler's just going to say, we're not going to follow this. But this was what it said. Number five, the League of Nations was formed. Number six, Germany had to pay reparations. This is, and the reparations were billions and billions of dollars, way more than Germany could ever pay in and still have a functional economy. And this is, of course, going to be one of the major things that drives Germany into an economic tailspin, sort of a period of time called hyperinflation, where its money was almost worthless. The German mark was hundreds of millions of German marks to buy bread. That's not an effective currency. And this uncertainty and this sort of power vacuum is going to mean people start looking for a strong leader. And we all know, of course, who the Germans are going to eventually look for, and we're going to come back to him later. This is what the top map is Europe before World War I. The bottom map is how the continent had changed after the war. All sorts of new countries. Certainly Poland exists for the first time. Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia. All these places that hadn't really existed as independent nations now do. For better or for worse, and we'll talk about some of the consequences as we get sort of closer to World War II. This is what the War Guilt Clause says specifically. The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts, the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associate governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of a war imposed upon them, by the aggression of Germany and her allies. You see that this is very pointed. I think historians have generally agreed since then that certainly Germany takes some blame. No one's arguing the other side of this. But to say that Germany and Austria-Hungary have all of the blame just doesn't add up from a historical perspective. Another map of Europe before 1919 and after 1919 of how the German and Austro-Hungarian empires were broken up. These are two great videos. I'll link to them on Canvas. I'm not going to spend time on this video showing them, but it's very, very much worth watching. They're great. I know they're cartoons, but they're great to explain the Treaty of Versailles. The war ends. Europe and the world enter what we call the interwar period between the two wars. And this period is noted most significantly for the rise of what we call totalitarianism. And I know we saw a video about this on Friday, but of course this comes from the word, the word totalitarianism comes from the word total. Whoever's in charge, whether it's the dictator or a political party or an emperor, has total control of what people can do, who people can marry, what kind of jobs people can have, what books and music people can listen to, where people can go, what other countries people can travel to. Now, we're going to talk about versions of totalitarianism, but Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito, all their versions were different. Some are based on ethnic or racial hatred. That would be sort of the Hitler-Hirohito model. Some are based on class or economics, which is the Soviet Union, based on the premise that workers should be in charge instead of the owners of businesses. That's of course Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and an ally of the United States, by the way. And then Mussolini's the idea is nationalism, rebuilding a Roman Empire. It's a fully Italian nationalist type of model. I want you to think. I'm not going to sort of have you write anything down about this, but what kind of freedoms might you think people have had under totalitarianism? And do you think they changed based on whether you are someone the ruling group agreed with or not? How much you feel? Once you're done going back and taking notes on all of this, please watch. You can either do it as a class or individually, the totalitarianism video. I've linked to it on Canvas, but I also have instructions here. This is the last page of the Google Slides. If you have any questions, ask certainly Mr. Wilcox or Ms. Funston. I will, I'm not going to be reachable really when you guys are watching this, but certainly, you can send me a note, and when I get back to my computer, I will look. Let's stop my share for a second. I will reach out, when I have pictures and information about the baby and how everything's doing. I hope you guys have a great week and make good choices, as I like to say to my son. And I will see you all when I am back. Take care.